Hello, my name is Kimberly Carey and I am the owner of So Sassy Stitcher in Northwest Arkansas. And this video is about cutting your fabrics correctly. People starting out may have some difficulty getting their fabric cut straight without dog legs in there where their fold is, getting it nice and straight, getting those 90-degree corners. I remember when I started out and I was like, where do I put the ruler and how do I do this, and making sure that things don't slip and move and all of that. So if you're just starting out, I want to help you out and be successful, because no matter how good your seams are, if you start out with a wonky cut piece, you're going to have a wonky quilt and things aren't going to match up the way that you want to, and you'll just be frustrated with it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is pre-washing your fabric. You can pre-wash your fabric to allow for that shrinkage. You don't have to, it's not a requirement. A lot of the kits and classes that I do, I don't pre-wash my fabric. If you buy high quality quilting fabrics, it's not as critical. If you buy lower end fabrics, then it's going to be more critical to do that, because they are going to shrink more and they could potentially have more bleeding into the other fabrics. And so if you have reds that are going to be paired with lighter colored fabrics like whites or yellows, then you're probably going to want to pre-wash those fabrics and do a color retainer so that that red doesn't bleed into those other fabrics. Now, some fabrics, no matter what you do, are gonna bleed into those other fabrics, and you just kind of want to be aware of that. If you have something that is going to be washed frequently, then you're probably going to want to pre-wash those fabrics. If you've got something that's just going to be a wall hanging or a decorative pillowcase that's not really going to get sat on or used, then the pre-washing of those fabrics isn't going to be as big of a deal. When you wash those fabrics, if some shrink more than others when they're already put in the quilt, then you could get some puckering and some things like that that are going to make it look wonky if you wash that piece. So with that in mind, once you have, if you pre-wash or pre-shrink, then you're going to want to iron it out really well, get all those wrinkles out. If you have a kit and you're not pre-washing your fabrics, that's fine too. Again, making sure that you're ironing that out, because if you have a big crease in it or anything like that, that's gonna mess up your cutting. The next piece of that, once it is ironed, is you want to make sure that it is folded correctly. And that seems really silly, but if you don't have it folded correctly, you're not going to get a straight line across that fold if you have to open it up or have a piece across that fold. So I'm going to talk about that here. On this one, you can see that I have my selvages together. This is width of fabric. If you ever see WOF, that is width of fabric. And so you have where it was cut on these sides. You have your fold down here and your selvages together here. So that is width of fabric. If they talk about length of fabric, that is going to be cut edge to cut edge, which is going to be different. And you're going to handle that slightly differently when you go to cut it. We're just going to talk about width of fabric today. So you can see that this piece lays nice and flat. My fold has no wrinkles in it, and my selvages are basically parallel together. Selvages are not completely even, and so they're not going to match up perfectly. That is okay. We just want to kind of split the difference across the length of that fabric and then have a nice fold at the bottom. Now, keep in mind that to get this nice fold at the bottom, your edges may not match up. Some bolts are folded wonky on the bolt, and so you may have edges that look like this to get a clean fold. And so, especially with less expensive fabrics, this is a bigger deal. Or if you just notice that when the quilt shop is unrolling that bolt and it looks wonky on the bolt, that you ask for a little bit extra. Most quilt shops will give you an extra 1/2 inch to 1 inch depending on how much you are getting. The smaller the piece, the less overlap they give you. If you get a bigger piece, several yards, you're going to get an extra about 1 inch of fabric. So you can see on this piece that my fold is, it's not a smooth fold. I have some waves in it. Okay, and I purposely did this to show you. When you iron, you should iron out the natural fold in the fabric because that may not be correct for where that needs to go. I over exaggerated this one so you can see that if I put this on here and I pull this out, this isn't laying flat and pretty. Okay, I've got wrinkles. This has some waviness to it. I want to smooth that out. So this top needs to go the other direction in order to lay flat. Now you can see if you go too far, you're going to get another fold the other direction. So you just want to smooth that out and make sure you may have to move the entire piece of it in order to get it to lay nice and flat. This does take some practice. The smaller the piece that you're working with, the easier this is to get it right. If you're working with a large piece of fabric, it can be more difficult, especially if I have had some pieces that the selvage on it is puckered, like it's smaller at the selvage than it is everywhere else, and that can kind of cause you some issues. If you snip that selvage just a little bit, it can release that, or you can just manage it until you get smaller pieces. So just keep that in mind. You want that fold nice and smooth. Now, if we look at this piece, I have it folded correctly, but it's not square exactly. It's not, the edges aren't nice and straight like I want them. This is oversized just a little bit from what I actually need to cut. I need a 2.5 inch strip from this. This is just over 3 inches wide. So they did give me a little bit of extra, which is nice because then I can clean up those edges. I can make sure it's folded correctly, clean up those edges, and get those nice crisp lines that I'm looking for. So in order to cut a piece of fabric initially, what we're looking at is we're going to be looking at this fold. Now, if this fold is correct, then it is going to give you a good baseline. It should be nice and straight. And then I'm going to pick a line on my ruler, and I am going to line up that line at that fold. And I'm going to make sure that it is nice and straight all the way across. Now, how your fabric is on your mat doesn't really matter. It can be wonky, whatever, as long as it's laying flat on your mat doesn't matter. I'm not using the mat to measure. The mat is really just there for me to cut on. Now, if I'm cutting a larger piece that's wider than what my ruler is, then I would use that to cut the width if I needed to. But for right now, I can just use my ruler. And so I have that line lined up along that fold. It's not on top of it, it's just below it so that I cannot see a gap between that line and the fold. And that is true all the way across the bottom of my piece. I have my ruler positioned so that I have a little bit of excess on this right-hand side. If I was left-handed and I'm cutting with my left hand, I would have the ruler moved over this direction so that I can cut on this side. But I'm right-handed, so I'm going to cut on this side of my ruler. Now, I make sure that my fabric is flat and not wrinkled underneath my ruler. This ruler is really nice because it has pre-grip or pre-stuck on grips so that it's less likely to slip. It's not foolproof though. You still have to put some pressure on it, but I don't have to like put my whole body weight on it to keep it still. So once I have that lined up, I'm gonna grab my rotary cutter and make sure I have a nice sharp blade on it so that we're not just sawing through the fabric. I'm gonna put my hand on the ruler so that I can keep it steady about halfway up, okay? I'm putting pressure on it, but I'm not putting my whole body weight on it. Then I'm gonna start at the bottom and I'm gonna go up just past my hand, okay? Now what I'm gonna do is I'm very carefully going to lift my hand straight up, and then I'm gonna put my hand down on the upper part to keep that steady, so that what that accomplishes, if I try to just leave my hand here and cut along, as I come up here, I'm more likely to put pressure because I'm pushing slightly against this ruler. I'm more likely to put pressure and move that ruler because it's not stable up here. And then I'm gonna get a leg, dog leg in my fabric, and that's not what I want. So hold, cut, hold, cut. You can lift your rotary cutter if you want to do that. You can leave it in place while you move your hand, as long as you don't move that. Now, if I move my hand and I realize that my ruler has moved, I can come back, straighten that ruler up, make sure that then this edge is lined up with what I've already cut, make sure my fold is lined up, then hold and cut again. But that's gonna make this not go like that. We want this nice straight 90-degree line, and you can always check it on your mat. But you can see I have a nice straight line, 90 degrees to my fold. Now, in order to get my 2.5 inches, I don't want to cut with my left hand. So what that means is I need to cut on this side, so it needs to be on my right hand side. I'm going to very carefully flip this piece over, making sure that my piece does not move from square. Okay, and if it does, I'm going to fix it before I go to the next step. All right, so this ruler in particular can be used both ways. It doesn't matter which way you turn it. You just have to make sure that you know which numbers you're looking at in order to get the right spot. So I'm looking at the white numbers. That is what is right side up to me, not the black numbers. The black numbers are upside down, so I'm not looking at those. When I put my ruler on my fabric, I'm looking at 2.5 inches is what I need. So again, I'm gonna line up at the bottom, making sure that that is square. And then I also wanna make sure that this 2.5 inch line is lined up all along that line that I just cut. Sometimes, especially with smaller pieces, when you move that piece, it'll wobble just a little bit. So I can actually go through and just straighten it out a little bit, making sure that it follows that line. As long as I'm not really stretching and pulling, I'm just adjusting a little bit. So my 2.5 inch line should be right against my cut side that I already cut, that's now on my left. Bottom should be lined up with that fold, nice and straight. Okay, so I'm at 2.5 inches. I'm double checking that that's the width that I need for what I need to cut. Again, when I cut, I'm gonna put my hand here. I'm gonna cut, I'm gonna move my hand, and I'm gonna cut the rest of the way. Again, with a nice sharp blade so that I don't get any, if it has a nick or anything in it, it's gonna leave a couple of strings that are still attached, and then it can pull your fabric and you'd have to go back over it and maybe even pull it out of line, and we don't want that. Okay, now in order to cut this into separate pieces, I'm gonna turn it sideways. Now I need some squares and some rectangles. I can do it with this. I can get a smaller ruler, a square or something like that, so it's not as big and cumbersome to do. And I can do it that same way, putting it on, cutting, moving that piece, cutting, and so on and so forth. If I'm cutting a lot of squares, then I can do a shape cut ruler. And what this is it has these little slats in it that you can cut along. And so I can cut multiple pieces without ever moving my ruler. So it's a lot faster if you have a lot to cut. So I will show you both ways of doing this. The nice thing about the shape cut is I'm going to put my selvage on my left side. So normally if I'm cutting something, I'm cutting on the right hand side. With the shape cut, it doesn't matter if you're left or right-handed. You can use it either way. So I am going to put my shape cut down so that my 0 mark, move this over so you can see it, so that my 0 mark is just past the selvage so that I can cut that selvage off. Okay, and I'm gonna put this, these lines are a lot thicker than what the lines on a regular ruler are. And so again, I just wanna line that up so that that line follows along the line of my fabric. Okay, so you can see I've got this 2.5 inch piece and I'm gonna cut squares on this. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut at 0. I need 4 2.5 inch squares. So I'm gonna cut at 2.5 and I'm gonna cut at 5 so that I get 2 sets of 2.5 inch squares. Then my next one that I need is actually 5 1/4. This is a 1/4 inch shape cut ruler. There is also a 1/2 inch that only has 1/2 inch increments. This goes in 1/4 inch increments. The 1/2 inch one is larger. It's 12 inches wide, so you can cut larger pieces of fabric. There's a ton of stuff that you can do with these shape cut rulers. We're not gonna go into all of that. I'm just gonna show you how to cut these. So I can cut at 2.5, 0, 2.5, 5. My next piece would be 5 1/4, so I would need 10 1/4. So that's what I'm gonna do first. So shape cuts don't have any grippies on them, so it's really important that for 2 things, that you hold it steady so that it doesn't move on you, because these do move a little bit more easily. And when you cut on these, you wanna cut straight and not flip your blade. Because these are movable, you can cut a little bit shy or a little bit extra if you push too hard one side or the other. So we wanna make sure that we're just cutting nice and straight. So I'm gonna cut that. When I come up, I don't have to go clear to the end to get up, but I also wanna make sure that I'm coming straight up and not coming out one side or the other. So I'm gonna cut at 2.5, at 5. I'm gonna move my hand over, making sure that it's still straight, and I'm gonna cut at 10 1/4. I'm gonna take that selvage away. I now have, because it's too thick, I have 4 2.5 inch squares, and I have a 5 1/4 inch by 2.5 inch rectangle. Now I'm gonna show you how to do that with a ruler. So I'm gonna get a ruler that's slightly larger than what I need. So I'm using a 6.5 inch square ruler. And so I wanna find my 5 1/4 inch mark. It is ideal to use a ruler that is slightly larger than what you're cutting and not do something that is the exact size of what you're cutting. It just makes it a little bit more precise. So I'm gonna find that 5 1/4 inch, and that is going to go on my cut edge. And then I can take any line. Solid lines, your inch lines, are gonna be your best bet, but you don't have to. You can use a 1/4 inch mark along there. And what that does for me is it allows me to see a little bit better if I'm lined up because there's more gaps there. So I have it lined up on this edge and I have it lined up on this edge. It should, because I've cut both sides of this, be lined up here. And so I want to make sure that I have 5 1/4, okay? Measure twice, cut once, and then I can go ahead and cut this. And if I needed to, I only need 4 of these. I cut one with the shape cut and I cut one that. Now, if I needed another one, I could do the same thing, but you can see how the shape cut is faster because I can cut multiple without having to move my ruler, okay? I'm not gonna cut another one here, but I want you to also see that when I open this up at this fold, it is still straight, okay? It lays straight. It doesn't come down like this. If you don't have your fabric folded correctly, this is what's going to happen. And then if you're trying to cut a piece across that fold to utilize your fabric efficiently, then that piece isn't going to be straight and you're going to be really frustrated with it. And end up having to use more fabric because you can't use it efficiently. So that's why we want to make sure that that fold is straight before we cut. We don't want that dog leg in that fabric. So I hope that this helps you cut efficiently. I'll do another video later on cutting larger fabrics and getting fabrics squared up. If you are cutting lots of strips off, sometimes you have to square that back up because either your ruler moves or the fabric moves a little bit, and we want to make sure that we're squaring that up in between every few pieces of strips that we're cutting because it will get a little bit wonky on you, and that's okay. That's just part of it. Fabric moves, it's fluid. It doesn't, it's not stiff like a rock. And so we just have to work with that, and you just have to know that that's okay and that that's what you should do so that you don't get those dog legs in there. Again, I hope this helped. Happy quilting, and I will do some more videos in the future on basic quilting skills so that more people can get started in this and hopefully keep this wonderful hobby alive. Have a great day.